Before there was ever a wedding, back when grief still owned every room in that house, Jaewon Lim sat across from his late wife's mother in a room Bennett was never part of, and said something he never repeated to another living soul, not even to the woman he'd go on to marry. It was the reason a grieving grandmother finally let her guard down. It's exactly what someone in that same family would spend months quietly trying to tear back apart. A grandmother would one day stand outside a courthouse with a folder full of headlines, ready to take two little girls from the only mother they'd ever really known. And she would have no idea that the person who put that folder in her hands, the person she trusted most, had a reason of his own that he'd never once said out loud. Not to her, not to anyone. Before we get into it, if you're already invested in Maya and Jaewon, hit that like button and subscribe now, because you are not ready for who's really behind what's about to hit this family. Okay, let's get into it. 10 months of marriage had turned the house on the hill into something Jaewon Lim barely recognized from the inside of his own grief. The drafting table by the window of glass stayed uncovered now, sketches pinned up instead of dust settling. The window seat he'd built for the girls had 3 names carved into the underside of the top shelf now: Hana, Yuna, and Maya's, added quietly sometime after the wedding, without her ever catching him at it, and one new blank space beside them that everyone in the house had started watching with quiet, private hope. Maya was 7 weeks along and hadn't told anyone but Jaewon and her mother yet. Some mornings she still couldn't believe any of it. The ring, the girls calling her Umma now, instead of Miss Bennett, Malik away at his first year of engineering school back east. The tuition quietly handled in ways Maya still hadn't fully thanked Jaewon for, because he changed the subject every time she tried. Hana and Yuna were 3 now, loud and opinionated, and utterly unafraid of a house that had once terrified them into silence. Yuna still slept with the yellow blanket, threadbare now, more whole than fabric. Hana had turned into a little narrator, announcing each thing she did as she did it. Hana climbing, Hana jumping, Hana done, in the plain, present tense way 3-year-olds report their own lives, and it made Mrs. Han laugh despite herself at least once a day. None of that peace had come easily, and least of all with Mrs. Kwon. What Jaewon had said to her the morning after the playground, in the formal sitting room of her house with a photograph of Soyeon at 17, watching them both from the mantel, was this: "I wasn't there enough while she was alive. I told myself work was how I loved her, and I was wrong, and I will carry that the rest of my life. I'm not asking you to forgive me for it, but I need you to know I see now what steady, present love actually looks like, because I watch it every single day in the way Maya holds our daughters, and I refuse to let my guilt over what I didn't give Soyeon stop me from giving the girls what they need now." Mrs. Kwon hadn't answered him that day. Not really. She'd simply nodded, twice, and let him leave. But something had shifted quietly after that, the way ice shifts before it finally breaks. A monthly lunch with Maya that turned real somewhere around the 4th visit. A nickname the girls had given her without being taught to, Halmoni, that she'd cried the first time she heard. By the time of the wedding, she'd meant every word of the bracelet she pressed into Maya's palm. It had never been peace exactly, not all at once, but it had held, steady and real, in all the months since. There was one person that peace had never quite reached. Soyeon's younger brother, Taejun, had stood at the back of the wedding with his wife Jaewon and left before the cake was cut. He was 2 years younger than the sister he'd worshipped his whole life, and he had never once, in the years since she died, said Jaewon's name without something cooling behind his eyes. He blamed Jaewon for the long, frightening pregnancy. For every month Soyeon had spent scared and alone on bed rest, while her husband was at a site inspection or a client dinner. In Taejun's version of the story, told and retold to himself until it hardened into fact, his sister had died reaching for a husband who was never in the room. He had made a quiet, private vow at her funeral that whatever was left of Soyeon in this world, he would not let slip away from her family. He simply never told anyone, not even his mother, what he'd already decided that vow required. Boss smiles at breakfast now, the cook told the housekeeper one morning, watching Jaewon attempt a French braid with the concentration of a man diffusing something explosive. Real ones. It should have stayed that simple. It didn't. The headline hit at 6 in the morning, while Maya was still in her robe making Hana's oatmeal, exactly the temperature she'd tolerate. Mrs. Han came into the kitchen holding her phone like it was something that might bite her, and set it face up on the counter without a word. Billionaire's nanny-turned-wife. Did she marry grief or money? Sources close to the family reveal a pattern of financial desperation, predating her employment. Under the headline sat a photo of Maya from her old NICU days. Grainy, unflattering, lifted from some long-shuttered community program flyer, beside a screenshot of a private message she'd sent a friend back in Atlanta the week she got the job. I need this. We're drowning. Daddy's bills are eating us alive. Someone had found it, and stripped every ounce of context from it, and put it in front of a few million strangers, before Maya had even finished pouring the oatmeal. Her hands went cold around the pot. Where did they get this? I don't know, Mrs. Han said, and for the first time since Maya had known her, the older woman looked frightened instead of formidable. Maya scrolled once, twice, feeling something in her chest cave inward, with each new comment stacked beneath the article. Strangers who knew nothing about a NICU caseload, or a father's hospital bills, or a mother mending clothes by lamplight, deciding in a sentence or less exactly who she was. One comment, sitting near the top with the most replies, simply read, "Some women will marry anything with money if you catch them broke enough first." 3,000 people had agreed with it before 8 in the morning. Hana wandered in, still in her pajamas, stopped, and looked at her mother's face, the way small children read a room before they have words for what they're reading. Umma sad, she said, just 2 words, plain and certain, and reached up to pat Maya's arm. Maya had to swallow twice before she could answer, I'm okay, baby, eat your breakfast, in a voice she barely recognized as steady. By the time Jaewon came downstairs, the story had already climbed. 2 more outlets had picked it up, embellishing with each republish, until the version circulating by 9 a.m. barely resembled a woman who'd once sat on a nursery floor, holding 2 screaming babies, until they trusted her heartbeat more than their own fear. Now she was a headline, a cautionary tale, a gold digger with a sob story, dressed up as a Cinderella arc for clicks. Jaewon read it standing perfectly still, the same way he used to stand at the wall of glass when Soyeon first died, present in body, gone somewhere else entirely. I'll call the lawyers, he said finally, voice flat with control. We'll issue a statement. This dies in a week. It didn't die in a week. That same evening, across the city, Taejun let himself into his mother's house with the key he'd always had, carrying takeout she hadn't asked for, and a tablet already open to the article. He didn't lead with the headline. He was far too careful for that. He set out her tea, asked about her knee, let her tell him about the girl's last visit, and only then, gently, like he was reluctant to bring it up at all, did he turn the tablet to face her. I didn't want you to see this from someone else first, he said. I'm not saying any of it's true, Umma. I'm saying, do you actually know who this woman is? Before the house, before the nice dresses at the wedding, do you know? Mrs. Kwan looked at the screen a long time. She loves the girls, she said, but it came out with a question mark she hadn't intended. I'm sure she does, Taejun said, and he even believed it, in the part of himself he didn't examine too closely. Soyeon loved them too, and she's the one who should be raising them. He let that sit. Then, softer, aiming without seeming to aim. You already lost Soyeon, Umma. I just don't want to watch some stranger slowly turn her daughters into someone else's children, and realize too late that we let it happen because we were being polite. He paused, then added, almost idly, she moved them to that new preschool over on Canfield, didn't she? Tuesday, I think. Mrs. Kwan frowned. How did you know that? I didn't even know that. I hear things. He smiled, easy, and reached for his tea. People talk. I keep an ear on my nieces, that's all. Somebody in this family should. It landed as devotion, and Mrs. Kwon took it as devotion. And only much later would she understand that a man does not know the exact day and street of a preschool transfer by accident. He never once said take them. He never said petition, or custody, or court. He asked questions instead, the kind that lodge under the skin and itch. Do you even know who's legally protecting the girls if something happens to Jaewon? What if she decides she wants to move them across the country? What's actually stopping her? And then the one he'd been saving, dropped lightest of all, on his way to the door with his coat already half on. I heard she's expecting her own baby, a real one, Jaewon's. He let the word real do its quiet work. I'm happy for them. I am. I just wonder, when that baby comes, when she's holding her own flesh and blood, where do Hana and Yuna land? First, or wherever's left over? By the time he kissed his mother's forehead and left, he had planted every seed he needed and touched none of them with his own fingerprints. Mrs. Kwon sat alone with a cold cup of tea and a fear that felt entirely like her own. By morning, she had called her lawyer. The letter arrived the following day, on the letterhead of a firm Maya remembered too well. Mrs. Kwon wasn't just worried. She was invoking a clause Maya hadn't known existed, buried in Soyeon's estate trust, drafted years before either woman had ever heard Maya Bennett's name, stating that any material change in the girl's home environment could trigger a court review of custody and guardianship to protect the interests and stability of the minor children. A scandal, the letter argued, was exactly that kind of material change. So was, it went on in careful legal phrasing, the impending arrival of a biological child to the household, a development that may materially alter the caregiving priorities of the step-parent. A hearing was requested. A judge had already been assigned. Maya read it twice at the kitchen table, feeling the floor tilt the way it had the day of the earthquake. Except this time, there was no table sturdy enough to get the girls under. It was the line about the baby that stayed with her longest, not because it was cruel, but because it had found the one fear she'd never said aloud to anyone. She put a hand over the 7-week flutter that wasn't a flutter yet, and hated, for one shameful second, that a stranger's lawyer had made her wonder about her own heart. She can't actually take them, Maya said, more question than statement. She can make it very hard for a long time trying, Jaewon said, and sat down across from her, like his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him. I should have told you about that clause. I forgot it existed. Soyeon's father insisted on it after we got engaged. Some old instinct about protecting the girls if anything ever happened to both of us. I never imagined it being used like this. He shook his head slowly, something in his face closer to bewildered than angry. It doesn't make sense. She laughed with Hana on that lawn. She stood at our wedding and gave you Soyeon's bracelet with her own hands. A headline doesn't undo everything we've built with her overnight. Something else is happening here. Against me. Against us, he corrected, low and immediate. This is not happening to you alone. Do you understand that? She wanted to believe him completely. But some small, tired part of her, the part that remembered people crossing the street rather than face her family when her father's bills came due, wondered whether a judge would look at a broke black woman from Atlanta with a headline like that one attached to her name and see anything but exactly what it accused her of. And underneath even that sat the smaller, uglier fear the petition had dug up on purpose, that when her own baby came, some animal part of her heart might quietly rank her children, blood first. She didn't believe it, but she was honest enough to know the fear was real, and being asked the question in a legal document had made it louder. That night, kneeling by the window seat with its one blank space, she let herself pray it all out loud instead of swallowing it. Lord, I know how to hold steady when the ground shakes. I don't know how to do it when the ground is a headline everybody in the world can read. She pressed one hand to the shelf where a fourth name would one day go, and the other, without deciding to her own middle. And don't let me love any one of these children a single inch less than the others. Not the ones I chose, not the one coming. Don't let me shrink, and don't let me choose. The press found the gate 2 days later. By Thursday, there were vans along the hedge line, and Mrs. Han had to walk Hana and Yuna to the car under a golf umbrella held low enough to block every lens. At preschool pickup, a mother Maya had traded small talk with a dozen times suddenly found something urgent on her phone rather than meet her eyes. Maya drove home gripping the wheel at 10 and 2 and let none of it show on her face by the time she was back through the gate. The girls understood none of it and felt all of it. That was the part that broke Maya quietest. Nobody had told them a single word about lawyers or grandmothers or courtrooms, and they didn't need to be told. Small children read the weather in a house the way animals read a coming storm, in the tightness of the adults, the phone calls that stopped when they entered a room, the way bedtime ran late because everyone had forgotten to watch the clock. Hannah, who had spent months growing bold, went clingy again, trailing Maya from room to room and asking to be picked up long past the age she usually insisted she could walk. Yuna started waking at 2 in the morning, the way she had that first winter, needing the humming before she'd go back down. And when Mrs. Han mentioned, gently, that they might visit their uncle's house that weekend, the way they sometimes did, Hana said no, with a flat 3-year-old finality, and would not be talked out of it, and could not have told anyone why. She just knew. Children always know before they understand. Maya held them a little longer at bedtime, and told them, in the only language that reaches that age, that they were safe, not with words, with the note, over and over, until the house went quiet. That night her phone rang, her mother's name lighting up the screen, and Maya almost let it go to voicemail before she made herself answer. "I saw it," Mama said, no preamble, voice fierce in a way Maya hadn't heard since a landlord once tried to shortchange her father's disability check. Some folks will print anything to sell a lie, and some folks will believe anything that lets them feel better about their own small hearts. You hear me? Not one word of that is who you are. It feels like it might be, Mama. Some days. Maya's voice cracked on the last word. What if a judge reads it the same way they did? Then that judge will meet the same woman who held 2 grieving babies steady through a night 4 other women ran from, Mama said. Rhythm outlasts noise, baby. Always has. You just keep counting. Then, softer. Malik called me the second he saw it online, away at that school and still worried sick over his big sister. A beat. He said to tell you, and I'm quoting the boy exactly, that anybody with a problem can take it up with him in writing, and he'll answer in perfect engineering major grammar. It was such a small, ridiculous thing to say that Maya laughed for the first time in 2 days, wet and real, and felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. The court moved faster than anyone wanted. Within the week, a family evaluator was assigned, a calm, unhurried woman named Ms. Delacroix, whose whole job was to spend time with the girls, in neutral settings, and form an opinion no lawyer could coach. The first session was held at her office, deliberately away from the house, away from Maya, so the girls could be observed without the person in question hovering. Maya kissed both girls at the door and made herself walk away, which was the single hardest thing she'd done since the earthquake. It did not go the way the petition assumed it would, and it did not go that way because nobody had to make it. The second session was arranged as a simple observation. The girls loose in a playroom with a bin of toys, Maya seated off to the side and instructed not to initiate anything, Ms. Delacroix watching from a chair by the wall, with a notepad she mostly didn't need. For a while the girls just played. Then Yuna, reaching too far across a low table, tipped off the edge of it and went down hard on the carpet, and did what small children do, froze, drew the enormous breath before the wail, and looked around the room for the one face that meant safe. Maya didn't get up. She'd been told not to, and she held to it, but the sound came out of her anyway, low and even and automatic, the same single note she'd been humming to that child since her first night in the house. She didn't call Yuna over. She didn't reach. She just hummed, the way you'd steady your own heartbeat without thinking about it. Yuna was in her lap before Maya finished the first breath of it, not walked, crawled, fast, the direct, unhesitating line of a child who has exactly one destination when the floor gives out. Hannah, seeing her sister move, abandoned her toys and climbed up the other side, and the three of them sat folded together while the note went on, and the crying that had been coming never quite arrived. Ms. Delacroix wrote one sentence and underlined part of it. Later, in her report, she would put it more formally, but at the time she said only, half to herself, "Well, they don't seem confused about where they go when it's bad." She had not asked the girls a single question about custody, or mothers, or uncles, or which grown-up they loved best, and she never would. She hadn't needed to. 3-year-olds can't argue a case, but they can tell you, without a word, whose lap is home. But an evaluator's impression, however clear, was one page in a thick file, and Taejeon's petition was built to outlast one good afternoon. It leaned on facts no bond could erase, that Maya had been hired help, that she'd married her employer, that a new baby was coming, that Mrs. Kwon was the last maternal grandmother standing. From the outside, in the flat grey language of a filing, the family really had changed enormously, in a very short time. Bonds don't show up in that language. And there was something else in that filing that Maya couldn't stop turning over. Buried in the supporting exhibits, meant to paint the household as chaotic and unstable, was a line noting that the younger child continues to experience nighttime waking and sleep disturbance. It was true. Yuna had started waking at 2 again, the week the vans showed up. But Maya had told no one that. Not the preschool, not the pediatrician yet, not even Mrs. Kwon. It was a thing that happened at 2 in the morning behind a closed nursery door, witnessed by exactly the people who lived in the house. And somehow it had made its way, in 3 weeks, into a legal document filed by a grandmother who hadn't slept over once. Somebody had been feeding information out of Maya's own home. She thought of the smaller things too, now that she was looking. How the petition knew the exact date of the preschool transfer, how it named the specific brand of the girl's vitamins, how it seemed to know the shape of her days better than a distant, grieving grandmother possibly could. Maya knew, sitting with that filing in her lap, that being loved wasn't going to be enough on its own. Someone close had built this on purpose. She was going to have to find out who and why. If you're as invested in this family as I am right now, take 1 second to hit subscribe before we go further, because what Maya's about to uncover is not what anybody watching thinks it is. Okay, back to it. 2 nights before the hearing, unable to sleep, Maya sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, doing the only thing she knew how to do when the ground shook: count the rhythm instead of the noise. She started with the leaked message itself. It had come from a private conversation on an old messaging app she barely used anymore, one she'd deleted from her phone within weeks of moving to Bel Air. Someone would have needed access to that account, or to someone who still had it. She thought of her old roommate from the temp agency days, the only person she'd still had that app to talk to back then. She texted her, gently, carefully, not accusing, just asking if anything strange had happened with her account. The answer came back within the hour, apologetic and a little scared. A man had reached out 3 weeks ago, claiming to be doing background verification for a family security firm, offering a generous consulting fee to confirm a few old messages. She'd thought it was legitimate. She'd sent screenshots. She still had his email. Maya stared at the sender's name for a long time before it meant anything. It wasn't a security firm. The consulting fee had come from a small private account, and the name on it, she almost missed it, tucked into a signature line at the bottom, was a management company she'd seen exactly once before, on a birthday card Mrs. Kwon had shown her, proud, months ago. "My son runs it," she'd said. "Taejeon. He does well for himself." Maya sat very still in the dark kitchen, the whole shape of it arriving at once, and understood that the person who'd handed Mrs. Kwon her fear had been standing inside the family the entire time. She didn't take it to Jaewon that first, because Jaewon would go straight to Taejeon's door, and it would become a war between 2 men who already despised each other, and nobody would come out of that believing anything except what they'd walked in believing. Maya had spent her whole life learning that the way to reach a frightened person is never through the person frightening them. So the next morning, she drove to Mrs. Kwon's house alone. Mrs. Kwon opened the door already braced, her face doing something complicated. Guilt and defiance and grief, all fighting for the same square inch. "I don't think we should be talking without lawyers," she said. "I'm not here as anybody's lawyer," Maya said. "I'm here as the woman who has your granddaughter's bath schedule memorized. Can I come in?" She didn't argue the headline. She didn't defend herself at all, which was the one thing Mrs. Kwon had no practiced answer for. She simply asked, quietly, whether they could sit, and then she asked about Soyeon, not to manipulate, but because she meant it. And for a while the two women just talked about a girl one of them had raised, and the other had only ever met through her daughters' faces. And somewhere in that, gently, Maya set her phone on the table, with the consulting payment on the screen. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know I'm not angry when I ask it," she said. "Did you know Taejun paid a man to pull those old messages of mine?" Mrs. Kwon went white. "No," she said. "No, he wouldn't. He came to me because he was worried. He was protecting the girls." "I believe he told you that," Maya said. "I even believe he believes it. But I'd like you to ask him one thing for me, and watch his face when he answers. Ask him where the girls would live." Mrs. Kwon did not sleep that night either, and in the morning, instead of driving to the courthouse, she drove to her son's house, because there was a question sitting in her chest now that she could not carry into any courtroom unanswered. Taejun wasn't home. Jaewon was, and she let her mother-in-law in with the too quick nervousness of someone who has been dreading a knock at the door for weeks. Mrs. Kwon had been in this house 100 times, but Jaewon stepped a little too fast to block the hallway, and that was the thing that made Mrs. Kwon walk down it. The door at the end had always been a study. Mrs. Kwon pushed it open expecting the study, and for a moment that's what she let herself see. A spare room, freshly made up, 2 neat beds against the wall. A guest room, she thought, with the reflex of a mother who did not want to think anything else. One of the beds still had a plastic sheet folded across the mattress, unused, waiting. "He's finally furnishing the spare room," she told herself. "That's all this is." Then her eye caught the notepad on the small desk, and she picked it up before she could decide not to. It was a shopping list, in her son's careful hand. Toddler bed rail, nightlight, and then, lower, in a column, Hana, shoe size 9. Yuna, 8.5. Below that, a note that stopped her breath entirely. Yellow blanket, buy backup. Why won't sleep without. A detail so specific to the inside of Maya's house that Mrs. Kwon felt the floor tilt. She set the notepad down and opened the desk drawer, and she should not have, and she did anyway, and inside was a folder, not a guest room folder. A folder with both girls' full legal names on the tab, and inside it their pediatric records, their vaccination history, a copy of their birth certificates she had no idea how he'd obtained. And clipped to the inside cover, a calendar, the coming months laid out, with certain days already circled in red and labeled in that same careful hand. Transition, move-in, first night. He had not been furnishing a spare room. He had been counting down. She turned slowly and looked at the whole room again, with the mercy gone out of her eyes, and now she saw all of it. The 2 beds, one for each. The picture books she recognized, because she had read them aloud herself. A basket of toys, a stuffed rabbit, exactly like the one Yuna had thrown across a crib, in a story Mrs. Kwon had only ever been told second-hand. And on the wall, framed and centered where 2 children would see them first thing every single morning, photographs of Soyeon, as if to teach 2 little girls, gently, over months, whose house this really was, and whose daughters they were always meant to have been. Mrs. Kwon stood in the middle of that room, and felt something in her chest come loose that had been holding since the day she buried her daughter. He was going to bring them here, she said. It wasn't a question. He wasn't asking for visits. He was counting down to a move-in date. Jaewon's voice was very small behind her. He said it was for when they visited. You don't circle a move-in date on a calendar for a visit. Mrs. Kwon turned, the folder still in her hand, and her face was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was grief that had finally understood itself. How long have you been building this? Jaewon's eyes filled. We can't have children, she whispered. 4 years of trying, 4 years of doctors, and then he'd look at those 2 little girls at every holiday, so much like Soyeon, being raised by… She stopped, ashamed of where the sentence had been going. He said they belonged with family. He said it so many times I stopped hearing how it sounded. I told him once. I told him, Taejun, they're not ours. And he looked at me like I'd said something cruel and said, they're my sister's daughters. Like that was the same thing. Like it settled it. Taejun came home to find his mother sitting on the edge of one of the 2 small beds in a room he had never meant her to see, and every practiced, careful thing he'd built for months fell away from his face at once. Umma, he started. You told me you were afraid she was taking Soyeon's children away from us, Mrs. Kwon said, and her voice shook. Look at me, and tell me that's what this is. For a long moment he said nothing, and then the truth came out of him, not as a confession, but as a plea, which was the most frightening thing of all, because he plainly did not think he'd done anything wrong. I was afraid she was taking them away from me, he said. They're all that's left of her, Umma. Every time I look at Hana, she has Soyeon's exact scowl, and they're being raised by a stranger who was hired, who was broke, who… I could give them everything. Jaewon and I could give them a mother and a father who are actually theirs by blood. How is that stealing? How is wanting my own sister's children stealing? Don't. The word came from the doorway, and it came from Jaewon, who had never once in 4 years of marriage raised her voice to him. She was shaking. Don't you dare put my name on that sentence, like we decided it together. I said yes to being there for them if something happened. I said yes to loving them. I never said yes to this. She stepped into the room she had helped him fill, and could no longer stand to look at. You told me we were saving them from losing their mother. That was the story. That was the story I let you tell me because I wanted it to be true. Because every baby shower I've smiled through, every doctor who's looked at me with that face. And here were 2 little girls who already exist, who already have Soyeon's eyes, and you made it sound like rescue. Her voice broke clean in half. But you were never trying to save them, Taejun. You wanted them to fill the room where our children never came, and I helped you decorate it. God forgive me, I hung the shelves. Taejun stared at her like the floor had moved. Jaewon, 2 beds, she said. You bought 2 beds and I told myself it was hope. It wasn't hope. It was a plan. She wiped her face hard with the heel of her hand. I wanted a child so badly, I let you convince me that taking someone else's was the same as being given one. It isn't. It was never going to be. And those girls would have grown up in a beautiful room, under their dead mother's photographs, wondering their whole lives why the people who loved them most took them from the only home that ever felt safe. For a long moment the room held nobody's breath. Then Mrs. Kwon spoke, quiet and final. She's right. And you know she's right. And some part of you has known it the whole time, or you wouldn't have needed me to file it instead of doing it yourself. She stood, unsteady, and put her hand flat against her son's cheek, the way she had when he was small. You do love them. I know you do. That's what makes this the worst thing you've ever done. You dressed up taking 2 grieving children from the only home they trust, and you told yourself it was rescue, and you used my grief to do it. Because you knew I was the one lock in that house that was never fully closed. Taejun's face crumpled. Whatever he'd built to keep from feeling the shape of what he'd done gave way all at once, and he sat down hard on the little bed beside his mother and wept. For Soyeon, for the children he and Jaewon would never have, for the niece's scowl he'd turned into a reason to break a family. It was not forgiveness. It was just the first true thing he'd let himself feel in 3 years. You're going to fix this, Mrs. Kwon said. Every piece of it. Starting with the man you paid. She was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again there was fear in it, the practical kind. But you have to understand, It may already be past what either of us can simply take back. I filed it. I put your evidence into a court record. That doesn't just disappear because I've changed my mind." She was right, and their lawyers confirmed it the next morning. A petition like this, once filed, wasn't a faucet you could shut off. The court had already opened a formal review into the girl's custody and welfare. The judge had accepted Taejun's exhibits into the record. The evaluator had been appointed and was obligated to complete and submit her findings, regardless of who now wanted what. A grandmother could withdraw as the petitioning party, but the machinery she'd started would keep grinding until a judge was satisfied, on the record, that the children were stable and safe. Mrs. Kwon's change of heart wasn't the end of the danger. It only changed what her testimony would have to do. She wouldn't be filing a fear anymore. She'd have to stand up in an open courtroom and dismantle it, publicly correct everything she'd sworn, name what her son had done, and hope the court believed a woman recanting her own petition more than it believed the tidy, damning document already sitting in the file. The custody review hearing was 2 days away, and truth arriving late doesn't always outrun a filing that arrived early, so Maya spent those days the only way she knew how, steady, unhurried, humming through bath time, letting the girls tangle their sticky fingers through her hair the way they'd done since they were 2, refusing to let fear write the next page before it was hers to write. The morning of the hearing, Mrs. Kwon was already outside the courthouse when their car pulled up. Her lawyer, a step behind her. Maya braced for the fight. Jaewon's lawyer had told them plainly the night before that a withdrawal wouldn't be enough on its own. The judge would want to hear directly from the evaluator and would weigh Taejun's exhibits, whether or not their author still stood behind them. Everything now turned on whether Mrs. Kwon, under oath, could make a court believe the truth as thoroughly as she'd once made it believe the lie. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Maya expected, fluorescent lit and unglamorous, nothing like the marble and glass she'd grown used to. When the judge invited the petitioner's counsel to proceed, Mrs. Kwon put a hand on her attorney's sleeve and stood up herself instead, and asked the court's leave to speak on the record, in her own words. The judge, after a long look at her, allowed it. "Your Honor, I filed this petition, and I'm here to take it apart with my own hands, because I'm the only one who can. A great deal of what was said about the woman across from me was said in public and under my name, and the truth deserves at least the same audience the lie got." The judge nodded for her to go on. "I was afraid," Mrs. Kwon said. "I lost my daughter, and I have been afraid every day since of losing what's left of her. Someone I trusted, someone inside my own family, found that fear and fed it, a careful spoonful at a time, until I believed a good woman was my enemy and mistook my own manipulation for instinct. He never told me to file this. He was cleverer than that. He asked me questions until I picked up the knife myself and thought it was mine." She drew a breath and made herself say the next part to the judge directly, because it was the part that mattered legally and the part that cost her most. "The exhibits in this file, the details about that household, the child's sleep, the schedules, did not come from my observation. They came from my son, who obtained them by paying to have this family watched, and who built this entire case not to protect these children, but because he and his wife cannot have their own, and he decided my granddaughters could fill that space. I did not know that when I filed. I know it now. And I could not live another day if I let a document I started take 2 little girls out of the only home where they've ever felt safe." She turned, then, to Maya, and her voice finally broke. "My granddaughters laugh again because of this woman. This family does not need protecting from Maya Bennett. It needed protecting from how loud grief can get when someone knows how to play it." Ms. Delacroix testified after her, unhurried and clinical, and her professional findings said in careful language what a scared 3-year-old had already said by crawling across a room. The children's primary attachment was secure, specific, and unmistakably to Maya, and disrupting it would do them harm. Between a grandmother dismantling her own petition under oath and an independent evaluator's report, the tidy, damning document in the file stopped looking like evidence and started looking like exactly what it was. The judge did not rule from the bench that morning, but the review that followed closed quietly in the family's favor within weeks, and the danger, at last, was truly over. The reporters who'd camped at the gate chasing a gold digger drifted off confused. A grandmother recanting is a far quieter story than a scandal, and quieter stories travel slower. A short correction ran a few days later, read by a fraction of the millions who'd read the first lie. Maya had stopped needing strangers to understand her story in order to trust it herself. Jaewon was not in the courtroom. He was, that same morning, sitting across from Jaewon in a coffee shop halfway between their two houses, at his mother's insistence and his own. The first conversation the two men had ever had that wasn't performed for someone else's benefit. There was no reconciliation in it. Not really. Jaewon was too angry, and had every right to be, but Jaewon said the thing his mother had made him understand he owed, out loud, without excuses, that he had been wrong, that the fear he'd handed his mother was his own, that the room he'd built would be taken apart that week. And Jaewon, who knew better than anyone alive what it was to let guilt over Soyeon curdle into something that hurt the people still living, did the hardest thing available to him. He didn't forgive, but he left the door open a crack. "The girls will want to know their uncle someday," he said, standing to go. "When you can be in a room with them without wanting to keep them, call me, not before." The one Jaewon couldn't stop thinking about afterward, though, wasn't Jaewon. It was Maya. A week later he asked, through his mother, whether his sister's daughter's stepmother would agree to see him, and to everyone's surprise she said yes. They met on a bench outside the same preschool he'd once known too much about, in daylight, in public, because Maya chose the ground and she chose it careful. He looked worse than she'd expected, hollowed out, a man who had finally stopped performing. "I know you hate me," he said. "I don't," Maya said. That undid him more than anger would have. He stared at her. "How can you not?" "I hate what you tried to do," she said, evenly, no heat in it, which made it land harder. "I hate that you looked at two little girls who trusted me and decided their love for me was a thing you had the right to take. I hate that you used a grieving old woman's worst fear as a tool. That I hate." "But you," she shook her head. "No, because I know exactly what grief can do to a person who stops letting anyone help them carry it. I watched it nearly hollow out your sister's husband before he let anybody in. Grief that gets carried turns into something you can live beside. Grief that gets hoarded turns into what you did. You didn't wake up a villain, you just kept it all yourself until it went bad." Taejon's eyes were wet. "They're so much like her," he said, helpless. "Hana has Soyeon's exact face when she's angry. I look at them and I see my sister still in the world, and I couldn't stand that she was in someone else's house." "I know, and she did. That was the thing. They are her, some of her, and they always will be. You get to love that. You get to be their uncle, really be it. Birthdays and scraped knees and terrible jokes, all of it. That door isn't closed, not from my side." She let a beat pass, and then she said the thing she'd driven over to say, quiet and immovable. "But you don't get to own them. Loving something has never once given anybody the right to possess it. You can love those girls with your whole heart for the rest of your life. You just can't take them to do it. The day you understand that those two sentences aren't the same, you'll be somebody safe for them to know. I hope you get there. I mean that." He didn't answer for a long time. When he did, it was barely above a whisper. "Soyeon would have liked you." "People keep telling me that," Maya said, and stood, and left him on the bench to sit with the difference between the two kinds of love, for as long as it took. That evening, the house exhaled the way it had after the earthquake. Not instantly, but slowly, room by room, until it felt like a home again, instead of a place under siege. Jaewon found Maya on the patio, where the paint fights, and the wedding, and every ordinary miracle in between had happened, one hand resting, still unconsciously protective, over the place where nothing showed yet, but everything had already changed. "You could have come to me the second you found his name," Jaewon said. Why didn't you? Because you'd have gone to his door, Maya said. And two angry men have never once in history talked each other into the truth. His mother was the only person who could reach him, so I went to her. She was quiet a moment. My mama always said you don't chase the noise. You find the one steady heartbeat in the room, and you get close to that. Jaewon looked at her for a long moment. He wanted them because he loved her, he said. So-yeon, that's the part I keep. I can't even hate it cleanly. No, Maya agreed softly. The worst things people do almost never come from hate. They come from love that stopped being able to tell the difference between holding on and taking. Rhythm outlasts noise, Jaewon said, trying the old words out in his own mouth, and Maya smiled, because he'd finally started to believe them. The girls felt the house settle before they could have named what had changed, and the clinginess eased the way it had come, without explanation. Maya was showing now, and the twins had discovered the belly with the total, uncomplicated fascination of 3-year-olds. Yuna took to pressing her whole face against it at bedtime, listening for something, and one evening she looked up and asked, "Is the baby coming soon?" The entire extent of her interest in the matter. Soon, Maya said. Hana, who had been arranging her dinosaurs along the edge of the window seat, considered this with great seriousness and arrived at the only question that struck her as important. Can we show the baby our window seat? Of course you can, Maya said. You two are going to be the best big sisters in the whole world. Neither girl had spent 1 second worrying about being replaced, or ranked, or loved less. The fear that had lived in the adults and the lawyers and a room across the city with 2 beds in it had never once touched them, because Maya had made sure of it. They only wanted to know if the baby could see the good spot by the window. That was all a 3-year-old should ever have to carry, and it was all Maya let them. 7 months later, the blank space Jaewon had carved beneath the girls' names finally got its fourth. A boy, born on a quiet Tuesday morning with his father's serious eyes and, everyone swore, his mother's stubborn lungs. They named him Elijah Sojin. Elijah for the strength Maya's mother always said carried a person through fire. Sojin woven in at Mrs. Kwon's quiet, tearful request. A thread of So-yeon stitched permanently into the family's next chapter, instead of set apart from it. Mama flew out for the birth, refusing every offer of a hired car, insisting on holding her grandson in the same kind of hospital chair she'd once sat in 3,000 miles away, waiting for word that her daughter had landed a job that would change everything. The Lord doesn't miss appointments, she said again, quieter this time, tears standing openly in her eyes, as she looked between Elijah and the 2 girls crowding her elbows to see him. Malik, home between semesters, took in the whole loud, overflowing room and said simply, "This is what we prayed for, back in that little front room. All of it, right here." And the fear the petition had dug up on purpose, the one Maya had prayed against on her knees by the window seat, she got to watch it answer itself that first night in the hospital. Because when the nurse finally settled the baby and dimmed the lights, it wasn't Elijah who wouldn't sleep. It was Yuna, overtired, off her schedule, in a strange, bright room, full of strange sounds, with too many grown-ups, and a new noise where the quiet used to be. She didn't understand any of it. She just knew it was wrong, and she did what she'd always done when the world went wrong, which was fold herself into the corner chair with the yellow blanket and cry. She wasn't crying about a baby. She was 3. She was crying because everything felt loud, and nobody's lap was holding her. "I'll take her," Mrs. Kwon offered, already half out of her seat, and it was a kind offer, the obvious one. Maya had given birth only hours before. She was pale and stitched and exhausted, and there were 4 sets of willing arms in that room. But Maya looked across at her daughter crying in the corner chair, and something in her simply refused. "No," she said, "she needs me." She didn't try to hold both children at once. She wasn't proving anything, wasn't staging a picture. She just handed Elijah, drowsy and content, into Jaewon's careful arms, and then held her own out toward Yuna, and started, low and even, to hum. Yuna crossed the room and climbed up against her side. and the crying that had filled the room a moment ago thinned and faded and was gone. That was all it was. That was the whole of it. Maya did not have one heart that ranked her children, and a lesser one held in reserve. She had the one heart she'd always had, the one that never asked which child mattered more, only which one needed her right now, and answered that, and only that, every single time. Jaewon had built a nursery on the belief that a mother's love was a fixed thing to be divided, a pie with only so many slices. Maya had never once loved that way. Love, the kind she carried, wasn't a quantity you split. It was a rhythm, and a rhythm doesn't run out. It just keeps counting, for whoever needs it, for as long as they need it. Mrs. Kwon held Elijah after Maya, tears finally falling without apology, murmuring something in Korean that Jaewon translated later, voice thick. "Welcome home, little one. Your sisters have been waiting for you." She had become, in the months since the hearing, the grandmother she'd always meant to be, present, unguarded, first to arrive and last to leave. Jaewon she did not bring. That healing, if it came, would come slower, and on the girls' terms, and years from now. But Jaewon sent a small knitted blanket for the baby, pale yellow, with a note in careful handwriting that said only, "I'm glad your family is whole." She and Jaewon had begun seeing a doctor of a different kind now, the kind who helps two people grieve the children they won't have, instead of trying to fill the hole with someone else's. It was the first honest thing they'd built together in years. Maya kept the blanket. The house on the hill, that had once gone silent under grief, then briefly dark under a fear someone inside the family had aimed like a weapon, filled instead with something that had taken years and one relentlessly steady woman to build back. Noise that meant safety instead of chaos, laughter instead of sirens, a rhythm nobody, not even someone who shared the girl's own blood, could manage to break. Maya Bennett walked into that house as a stranger, being tested by 4 nannies' worth of failure before her. She stayed through grief, through an earthquake, through a betrayal dressed up as family loyalty, and every single time, she chose to keep counting instead of running. In the end, none of it was really about custody, or headlines, or a hidden room with 2 beds in it. It was about the oldest confusion there is, the difference between loving someone and owning them. Jaewon's love asked, "What do I need you to be for me?" Maya's love only ever asked, "What do you need?" One of those built a nursery to trap 2 children inside their dead mother's memory. The other built a home where they were free to become whoever they were going to be. That's not luck. That's not even love. Not entirely. That's the rarest kind of strength there is. Staying steady when it would have been so much easier not to. Reaching for the frightened heart instead of the loud one. And loving 2 little girls enough to never once need to keep them, only to keep showing up. If this story moved you, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, stay patient, stay soft-hearted, and keep watching.